And Henry, if I'm going to go fast because I'm going to stay on time, but I don't have a problem with you sharing these slides with others who care to look at them later. Um, so the first principle here is that the goal is independent reunification. And if you parse the language carefully in what these joint statements say, independent reunification means reunification without the United States present. It means we break the alliance between the US and South Korea. Counterpoint, I think that keeping some US forces in Korea without missile defense and without a lot of air cover might actually be to Pyongyang's benefit on a couple of levels. It would leave them some hostages, and it would also give the South Koreans a false sense of security that has given political cover to the leaders of South Korea as they have signed all of these joint statements. Um, the other piece of language that you should parse here is that the statement that the Korean people are masters of their own country. If you read, it's a somewhat obscure book and it's a thick read, but if you read Professor B.R. Myers's North Korea's Juche myth, he takes apart the common trope that Juche means self-reliance, and he actually traces it from Immanuel Kant to some Japanese philosophers in the 30s to modern North Korea. And it's really not self-reliance so much as the collective people are the masters of their own destiny without any foreign influence. Next slide, please. And here is a term that North Korean propaganda has popularized. Those of you who have lived in South Korea will have observed that it is a very, very nationalistic country. Um, it was probably much more so when I was there than it is today. I was there at the peak of the um, protests around, I want to say, 2000 to 2002, but nonetheless, South Korea is defensively nationalistic because it has been between China and Japan and Mongolia and other powers that sought to occupy it. They they clung to nationalism to preserve their culture, their language, their sense of nationhood, and their resistance to occupation. And that remains very strong, and North Korea exploits that very strongly. And this is primarily done to gain popular approval in both North and South, and the leaders of both North and South know that this language sells. Next slide, please. Here is the specific language for what Confederation is supposed to look like according to the joint statements. And I'm just going to stop. I won't read it to you, but I'll just give you a minute to pause on that. This is the first of two slides, and I'm just going to let you look at that language. Okay, and let's go to the next slide, please. This is where things begin to get more ambitious. Now we're actually talking about overhauling legislative and institutional apparatuses. But in 2007, as today, we are talking about two very different political systems. One that we believe to be a strong democracy, and another which is maybe the world's most totalitarian state. How can these two systems really be reconciled? And there at the bottom is the building in Kaesong where this confederation was supposed to have been set up. The construction on that building began in 2005, and who knows what happened to that building in 2020? Nobody. The North Koreans blew it up because they didn't think the South was moving fast enough on implementing the agreement. Next slide, please. General Chun, if you wouldn't mind, I think you ask an excellent question, and I'm going to give you my favorite theory at the end of my talk. Um,
No, 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 not at all.
okay, thank you, sir. So this is from, sorry, I lied. It's 3 slides, not 2. I broke it up so that it would be a big enough font for you to all read. But again, there was a serious intent on the part of on the part of the Moon administration to actually implement this and to make it a matter of law. And somehow, at the last minute, the South Korean National Assembly, which was dominated by Moon's own party, got cold feet. But it is a system where the opposition does have a lot of opportunities to obstruct. And so it never got to the phase that the president had asked. Next slide, please. Another term that you will have seen in the joint statements going back as far as 1991 is balanced development. That means pay us money. That means bring our industrial economy something toward the level of your industrial economy. This was initially manifested by things like the Kumgang Tourist Park, which closed down after the shooting of South Korean tourist Park Gwang-ja, and the Kaesong Industrial Complex, which was shut down after the 2016 nuclear test. But note that the Kaesong Industrial Complex opened almost at the same time as the UN first approved a Chapter 7 sanctions resolution against North Korea. Next slide, please. And here, again, we begin to get more ambitious in the goal. By 2007 and 2018, we now have Chapter 7 sanctions against North Korea. The sanctions have a provision in paragraph 8D of Resolution 1718 that says that any funds or economic resources transferred to North Korea, the transferring entity, whether it be a government or an entity under the government's jurisdiction, is responsible for ensuring that the funds are not used for any prohibited purpose in violation of the sanctions. South Korea's government has historically flipped that analysis on its head and said, well, we don't know for a fact that the North Koreans are using the $100 million a year we send them for nuclear weapons. Therefore, we're not violating the sanctions. By 2018, of course, Kaesong is gone. And then there are the new schemes like Ian Young's barter trade proposal, relinking railways, and so on. The United States actually had to set up a contact group with the Moon administration to stop some of these sanctions busting projects from going forward. That included a phone call from Undersecretary of the Treasury Sigal Mandelker to a bunch of South Korean bankers, warning them that they were in danger of losing their access to the financial system. And what we also saw was that South Korean energy companies, Enermax, the state power company, was importing North Korean coal in violation of a UN embargo after being told not to. So there was really, again, an ambivalence on the part of that South Korean administration toward following UN sanctions. This is, of course, a state that owes its existence to the United Nations. Next slide, please. By the way, I can't resist the opportunity to point out that the sanctions that presidents love to say are very strong are in fact poorly enforced. The blue bars that you see there are just an indicator of the raw number of sanctions designations by the Office of Foreign Assets Control. That is a timeline that compares to, at the bottom of the same chronology, you can see nuclear tests, you can see major diplomatic engagements and agreements. You had a brief period in the Trump administration when there was a lot of designation activity. That all dropped off when Kim Jong un agreed to the summit in Singapore. And what is not on that graph, because how do you graph a negative, is that no major bank has ever been penalized for violating North Korea sanctions, compared to Iran, where you've had 9-digit penalties, and in one case, a 10-digit penalty against European banks for violating Iran sanctions. We have never seen the same seriousness of purpose in enforcing North Korea sanctions. And we are now at a place where we have lost the institutional backing of the UN. It will be twice as difficult to assemble an ad hoc coalition to restore any level of pressure or leverage. Next slide, please. Uh, Another point that is in the joint statements starting in 1972 is that the governments agreed not to defame or slander each other. North Korea, not surprisingly, has seen that as a requirement for the South Korean government to rein in civic groups, NGOs, and even the press sometimes. It has been increasingly bold about this starting around 2020. This was probably not a tough thing for Park Chung-hee to agree to. After all, in 1972, he was no civil libertarian. But only recently have we seen that South Korea has been willing to institutionalize through law the censorship of speech that offends the North. Next slide, please. Um, you know what? Why don't we go ahead and skip this?